The Temple of Silence, the impossible engineering of God's house. Prologue. The enigma of Mount Moriah. History is filled with architectural wonders. The pyramids of Giza, the Parthenon of Athens, the Colosseum of Rome. But centuries before Rome was even a village, and while Greece was still finding its cultural footing, a construction project took place in the Judean mountains that defies modern engineering logic. It was not the largest building in the world by footprint, but it was, by every metric of density, value, and precision, the most complex structure of antiquity, the Temple of Solomon. To the casual reader of the Bible, it is a place of worship. To the historian, it is a center of ancient political power. But to the engineer and the architect, it is a baffling anomaly. We are talking about a structure where the foundation stones weighed up to 400 tons, equivalent to a herd of 60 adult elephants compressed into a single block of limestone. We are talking about an interior lined with 27 tons of pure gold, a quantity so vast it would destabilize modern markets. We are talking about bronze casting on an industrial scale that would challenge a 21st century foundry. And perhaps the most haunting detail of all, it was built in total silence. For 7 years, the construction site of the most magnificent building on earth heard no hammer, no axe, and no iron tool. It was a ghost machine of 150,000 men moving mountains without a sound. How was this done? How did a civilization without hydraulic cranes, combustion engines, or diamond-tipped saws achieve millimeter precision on a megaton scale? To understand the temple, we must strip away the myths and look at the dirt, the sweat, the physics, and the terrifying logistics of the house of God. Chapter 1. The Stones of the Giants. The first challenge was not the temple itself, but the ground it stood on. Mount Moriah was a rugged, uneven ridge. To build a house for the eternal, Solomon needed a platform, a flat, unshakable foundation that could support the immense weight of the gold and stone to come. The Bible records in 1 Kings 5:17 that the king commanded them to quarry large stones, costly stones, and hewn stones to lay the foundation of the house. The term large is a drastic understatement. Archaeological excavations around the Temple Mounts, specifically the Western Wall tunnels, which reveal the Herodian expansions built upon Solomonic precedents, have uncovered monoliths that stop the heart of modern masons. Some of these blocks are over 12 meters long. They weigh hundreds of tons. Why use such massive stones? Why not use smaller, manageable bricks? The answer lies in stability. A wall made of 1,000,000 small bricks has 1,000,000 points of weakness. A wall made of 400-ton monoliths, held together by gravity alone, is earthquake-proof. It is eternal. But how do you cut a 400-ton rock out of a mountain when you don't have dynamite? The water and wedge techniques. Solomon dispatched 80,000 men to the quarries deep in the limestone hills of Jerusalem. These men were the hewers of stone. Their technology was primitive, but their understanding of geology was masterful. They could not hack at the rock with pickaxes. That would shatter the stone. Instead, they used the patience of nature against the rock. The master masons would identify the grain of the limestone. Using drills made of harder stone or primitive bronze, they would bore a line of holes along the desired fault line. Into these holes, they inserted wedges of dry wood. Then, they poured water. It was a slow, silent weapon. As the dry wood drank the water, it expanded. The hydraulic pressure generated by the swelling wood was immense enough to crack the earth's crust. The workers would wait, sometimes for days, listening for the dull thud deep within the mountain that signaled the rock had surrendered. The mountain was not conquered by force. It was conquered by physics. The rule of silence. Once the block was separated from the bedrock, the real work began. And here, the strangest rule of the construction came into play. And the house, when it was in building, was built of stone made ready before it was brought thither. so that there was neither hammer nor axe, nor any tool of iron heard in the house, while it was in building. 1 Kings 6-7. This was a divine mandate. Iron was the metal of war. Iron made swords, spear tips, and arrowheads. The altar of God was to be a place of peace, and therefore, the sound of violence, the clashing of metal on stone, was forbidden on the holy hill. This meant that every 400-ton block had to be dressed, smoothed, and measured to perfection at the quarry, miles away. There was no measure twice, cut once at the construction site. If a block arrived at Mount Moriah and was 2 millimeters too wide, it could not be chiseled down, it had to be rejected. The pressure on the quarry architects was crushing. They used a system of complex geometric markings. Symbols were carved into the rough faces of the stone's instructions for the layers, the orientation, and the interlocking joints. These were the blueprints of the ancient world, etched in rock. Chapter 2: The Physics of Transport. If cutting the stone was a feat of geology, moving it was a miracle of physics. We are looking at a block of stone weighing 400 tons. To visualize this, imagine a fully loaded Boeing 747. Now imagine dragging it across a mountain range without wheels. Solomon assigned 70,000 men to be bearers of burdens. These were the haulers. They were the engine of the project. The terrain around Jerusalem is not the flat sand of Egypt. It is a land of valleys and ridges. To move these monoliths, the engineers likely constructed a series of massive earthen ramps. These ramps had to be graded at a very specific angle to steep, and gravity would pull the stone back, crushing the workers to shallow. And the ramp would stretch for miles, wasting resources. The roller system, the stones did not drag on the ground, they rolled. Thousands of tree trunks, likely oak or cypress, were laid out like train tracks. The stone was levered onto a sled, and the sled was placed on the rollers. Ropes made of twisted hemp, thick as a man's thigh, were lashed around the blocks. Hundreds of men were harnessed to these ropes. This was a human machine. Heave, the friction was the enemy. To combat it, teams of water carriers or oil pourers ran ahead of the sleds, slicking the rollers to reduce the drag. The danger was absolute. If a rope snapped, the backlash could decapitate a man. If the stone shifted its center of gravity, it could flatten a platoon of workers in a second. The supervisors, numbering 3,300, were the nervous system of this beast. They coordinated the movements, the brakes, and the rhythm. It was a slow, agonizing dance. A single block might travel only a few hundred meters a day. And all the while, the clock was ticking. 7 years. That was the timeline. In the ancient world, projects of this scale usually took decades. The pyramids took generations. Solomon wanted it done in 7 years. The urgency added a frantic energy to the brutal labor. Chapter 3: The Alliance of Cedars. While the mountains of Judea groaned under the weight of stone, a different operation was underway to the north. A temple of stone is a cave. To make it a palace, one needs wood. And for the house of God, only the best wood on earth would suffice, the cedars of Lebanon. These were not common pine trees. The cedar of Lebanon, Cedrus libani, is a titan. It grows slowly, producing a wood that is incredibly dense, richly aromatic, and naturally filled with oils that repel rot and insects. It is wood that lasts for thousands of years. But these trees grew in the high snowy peaks of the Lebanon range, 200 kilometers away, in the territory of King Hiram of Tyre. Solomon was a diplomat as much as a builder. He struck a trade agreement with Hiram that was staggering in its scale. 1 Kings 5:11 tells us the price: 20,000 cors of wheat, roughly 400 liters, and 20,000 baths of pressed olive oil, roughly 440 liters every year. Israel was feeding the Phoenician nation in exchange for their trees. The lumberjack army. Solomon drafted 30,000 Israelite men for this task. They worked in shifts. 10,000 men would march north to Lebanon, work for a month in the freezing high altitudes, felling giants, and then return home for 2 months while the next shift took over. Adoniram was the general of this labor force. The logistics of moving these trees were as complex as moving the stones. Once a tree was felled, it had to be stripped and dragged down the mountain to the coast. There, the Phoenician experts, the greatest sailors of the ancient world, lashed the massive logs together into gigantic rafts. These rafts were floated down the Mediterranean coastline, bobbing in the surf, guided by Phoenician galleys until they reached the port of Joppa, modern-day Jaffa. But the journey wasn't over. Joppa is at sea level. Jerusalem is 750 meters above sea level, nestled in the mountains. The Israelites had to drag these thousands of tons of timber uphill for 60 kilometers. It was a logistical nightmare that required roads to be widened and grades to be smoothed, solely for the passage of the wood. Chapter 4. The furnaces of the Jordan. Stone provides the structure. Wood provides the lining, but gold provides the glory. The statistics of the gold used in Solomon's temple are difficult to comprehend. The Bible says 27 tons of pure gold were used for the interior cladding alone. In today's market, that is billions of dollars. But in the ancient world, it represented the GDP of entire empires. Where did it come from? The Bible lists the sources: tributes from vassal states, the mines of Ophir, the Queen of Sheba, and the accumulated treasury of King David. But raw gold is useless. It must be refined, beaten, and shaped. Solomon did not trust local talent for the most artistic metalwork. He hired a master craftsman from Tyre named Huram or Hiram. He was the Da Vinci of his day, a man described as being filled with wisdom and understanding to work in gold, silver, bronze, iron, stone, and wood. The bronze foundry Huram set up his industrial base in the plain of the Jordan River, between Sukkot and Zarethan. Why there? Because the clay soil there was perfect for creating the massive molds needed for casting. It was here that Huram cast the 2 pillars that would guard the entrance of the temple, Jachin and Boaz. Each pillar was 8 meters high and 4 meters in circumference. They were cast of solid bronze. The weight of a single pillar is estimated at 34 tons. To pour 34 tons of molten bronze in a single continuous casting requires a furnace technology that historians still struggle to reconstruct. It required a coordinated pour from multiple crucibles simultaneously, with zero margin for air bubbles or cracks. Nearby, he cast the molten sea, a gigantic water basin resting on the backs of 12 life-sized bronze oxen. The basin held 45,000 liters of water. The heat in the Jordan Valley, combined with the heat of the furnaces, must have been hellish. The gold beaters back in Jerusalem. The gold work was different. It wasn't cast, it was hammered. The walls of the temple were lined with cedar, and the floors with cypress. But Solomon decreed that no wood should be seen. Every inch of the interior was to be overlaid with gold. This required the creation of thousands of gold sheets. Workers sat at stone anvils, hammering nuggets of gold day and night. They had to achieve a uniform thickness, thin enough to be shaped over the wood carvings, but thick enough to be durable. The Bible details that carvings of gourds and open flowers were cut into the cedar wood. The gold sheets were then pressed over these carvings, so the relief of the flowers appeared in the gold. It was a shimmering, golden garden. But the centerpiece of the gold work was the Holy of Holies. This was a perfect cube 9 meters by 9 meters by 9 meters. Inside this room, Solomon placed 2 cherubim made of olive wood. Each stood 5 meters 15 feet high. Their wingspan was 4.5 meters. They were not solid gold that would have been too heavy for the floor. They were wood, overlaid with hammered gold. Imagine the scene. The room is windowless. It is absolutely dark. But the entire room floor, walls, ceiling is gold. the 15-foot angels are gold. When the high priest would later enter with a censer of fire, the reflection of that single flame against the gold would create an infinite, blinding fracturing of light. It was designed to look like the inside of a star. Chapter 5. The Assembly of Silence, Year 6. The materials were gathered, the foundation was set. Now, the great assembly began. This was the moment of truth for the quarry architects. The massive stones were dragged into position. Because of the prohibition on iron tools, the workers could not use crowbars to nudge the stones into place. They likely used pulleys made of strong Lebanese cedar and ropes to lower the blocks. Click. The silence of the fit was the loudest sound on the mountain. Stone met stone with such precision that, to this day, you cannot fit a sheet of paper between the joints of the Herodian stones which followed the Solomonic tradition. They didn't use mortar. They relied on perfect flatness and the immense weight of the stones to seal the wall. The walls rose, the cedar beams were slotted into place. The roof was sealed. Then came the interior crew. They pinned the gold sheets to the wood using gold nails. The Bible even records the weight of the nails, 50 shekels of gold each. The windows were designed specifically. They were narrowing windows, wide on the inside and narrow on the outside. In ancient architecture, windows were usually the opposite, to let light in. But the temple windows were reversed to signify that light comes from within the temple out to the world, not the other way around. The organization of the administration of this project rivals the construction itself. 150,000 workers need to eat. They need water. They need sanitation. Solomon's bureaucracy was ruthless and efficient. He had established supply lines that fed this army of workers. The cost was enormous. It nearly bankrupted the northern tribes and sowed the seeds of the future civil war. But for 7 years, the machine did not falter. The discipline was absolute. 3,300 supervisors meant there was one boss for every 45 men. There was no slack. The spiritual weight of the project permeated the workforce. They weren't just building a monument for a king. They were terrified of the God who would inhabit it. The fear of the Lord was the beginning of this architecture. Chapter 6. The Descent of Glory. In the 8th month of the 11th year of Solomon's reign, the final nail was driven. The silence of the construction was replaced by the silence of anticipation. The building stood finished. It was a white limestone mountain on the outside, a golden sun on the inside. Solomon called for the dedication. It was the Feast of Tabernacles. The entire nation of Israel, millions of people, flooded Jerusalem. The city could barely contain them. The procession began. The priests lifted the Ark of the Covenant, the ancient wooden box covered in gold, containing the 10 Commandments. This was the heart of the machine. The temple was, in essence, just a protective shell for this one object. They carried the Ark up the steps, past the bronze pillars, Jachin and Boaz, through the holy place with its tables of bread and incense, and into the Holy of Holies. They placed the ark beneath the outstretched wings of the giant golden cherubim. The staves were withdrawn. The priests backed out of the room. The veil was drawn. And then, the engineering ceased to matter. And it came to pass, when the priests were come out of the holy place, that the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord had filled the house of the Lord. 1 Kings 8:10-11. The Shekinah, the heavy, dwelling glory of God, crashed into the physical world. It wasn't smoke, it was a substance of holiness, so thick that it physically pushed the priests out of the building. The connection was made. The gold, the cedar, the 400-ton stones, they had successfully created a container for the infinite. Solomon stood before the altar. He was the richest man on earth, the wisest king in history, the master builder. But in that moment, he was dwarfed by his creation. He offered a sacrifice that broke the economic logic of the ancient world. 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. The blood flowed like a river. The smoke of the altar blocked out the sun. It was a statement of total surrender. The value of the livestock alone was enough to feed a nation, but Solomon burned it all in a week of worship. Epilogue: the legacy of the impossible. Solomon's temple stood for nearly 400 years before it was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. The gold was stripped, the bronze pillars were broken up and carted away, and the cedar was burned. But the legacy of the construction remains. The retaining walls of the Temple Mount, expanded later by Herod, still stand. We can still touch the stones. We can still see the drafted margins of the masonry. The Temple of Solomon remains the ultimate case study in what is possible when human limitation is pushed by divine inspiration. It teaches us that patience, the water wedges, can break the hardest obstacles. It teaches us that cooperation, the alliance with Tyre, is necessary for greatness. It teaches us that reverence, the silence, turns labor into worship. Modern engineers look at the numbers: the 400-ton stones, the 27 tons of gold, the 7-year timeline, and they shake their heads. By all rights, it should not have been possible. But the stones of Jerusalem still cry out the truth, that once, on a ridge in Judea, men touched the impossible because they were building a home for the God of the impossible.